This last section of Chapter 7 is on bacterial diseases. So we've kind of sprinkled in some bacterial diseases throughout the class. Once upon a time, we used to have all of the bacterial diseases at the end of the semester. So we just found it a little bit easier just to kind of sprinkle them in. So you are going to see some diseases of different parts of the body that affect different parts of the body. These are all going to be bacteria. When we get to the viral chapter, we're going to be talking about some viral diseases. Remember, this is not a human health and disease class, so you are not going to have extensive knowledge of symptoms and treatments. This is really for recognition. So the first disease, this is a disease of the lower respiratory tract. This is Mycoplasma pneumonia, also known as walking pneumonia. Sometimes people will call it atypical pneumonia. This is actually caused by the smallest known bacterial pathogen. It actually lacks a cell wall. That is the mycoplasma. This can be common with adolescents, with teenagers. Sometimes they may have symptoms. Sometimes no signs or symptoms. It usually is treated with antibiotics. I know that in my kids' high school classes, it was not uncommon for atypical pneumonia to spread through classrooms. I remember once my son was coughing, wasn't really sure what it was, finally went to the doctor and they diagnosed him with walking pneumonia or atypical pneumonia. He was on antibiotics and he was fine within no time. Another disease, which is also of the lower respiratory tract, is Legionnaire's disease. And this is not a particular bacteria that is going to be transmitted from person to person. This is actually something that tends to be in water supply, so air conditioning units, so big HVACs, also pools, hot tubs, things like that. And what happens is that it actually becomes an aerosol and then people can inhale it. So you actually have to be in contact with it. And it can cause fever, chills, GI effects, and it can actually be fatal. So this is actually named for an outbreak of this disease that occurred in 1976 at a convention of war veterans. So this is actually where it got its name, Legionnaire's disease. You do hear about this once in a while, especially in the summertime when buildings have their air conditioning going. And if this happens to get into the system, it can spread that way. A couple of years ago, I remember there were some cases of Legionnaires in Hampton Beach, New Hampshire. And of course, as you know, every summer, a lot of people descend on Hampton Beach, and they were concerned about people getting ill. And there had been a few people that had gotten sick, and it was taking a while just to kind of trace to figure out where it was coming from. Turns out it was actually coming from a local motel that people that were staying there and then went into the hot tub. They were actually getting it that way. So we do hear about it especially in the summertime, cities, vacation areas. But again, it cannot be spread person to person. This is something that you would have to get from the environment. Then we'll talk about some bacterial STDs, or sexually transmitted diseases. So first up is gonorrhea, which is caused by Neisseria gonorrhea. This is a venereal disease, but it can also affect other parts of the body. Sometimes people can be asymptomatic, so they might not know they have it and they can actually spread it. It can be treated with antibiotics. Syphilis, which is a spirochete. Remember, a spirochete is that corkscrew-shaped bacteria. This causative agent is Treponema pallidum. And this is also an STD, but it can be passed in saliva. So people can get lesions not only on their genitals, but hands and lips as well. This can also cross the placenta, so babies can get it as well. Again, it can be treated with antibiotics. The most common bacterial STD is chlamydia. This is the most common in the US. Again, some people can be asymptomatic and still spread it. It can also cause some issues with fertility. This is a particular disease that I always think of. One of the favorite movies in our house to watch is Mean Girls. And there is actually a scene where the main character is being called down to the principal's office, and she's in health ed. And the gym teacher who is teaching sex ed at the time starts to talk about chlamydia. And the famous line is, don't have sex because you'll get chlamydia and die. And then, of course, he goes on to spell chlamydia with a K. If you haven't seen the movie, you could actually Google, you can look up on YouTube that little scene. It's kind of amusing, and I can't talk about this without thinking of that movie. Of course, it is no laughing matter. It is the most common STD. All right, some other bacterial diseases. This is of the brain and meninges. So the meninges are the protective coverings tissue of the central nervous system. So they line our brain and spinal cord, and it can cause inflammation. Of course, this can be super serious because if you get pressure building up in your brain, that's obviously not a good thing. There are lots of different causative agents of meningitis. Viral meningitis is usually not fatal. Bacterial meningitis is really the very serious form, and it can be caused by a variety of things. For example, strep pneumonia can actually cause it. This is one of those diseases, and there are various bacterial diseases that can cause meningitis. And now we can actually vaccinate for some of those. So I know when my kids went off to college, before they went to college, they were required to get vaccines, and some of those vaccines were actually for meningitis. This is one of those things that they warn of, that you can be fine 1 minute, and then 24 to 48 hours later, you could be dead because it moves so quickly. I heard of a case, somebody was telling me about their friend that ended up with bacterial meningitis, ended up from a sinus infection that they had that ended up moving into their brain. They were extremely lucky that they were able to recover. And it has been a very long recovery of, several months. This is usually, it's brought on quickly, and some of the symptoms can be like a headache, stiff neck. This is one of those things that, when my kids complain about, their head hurting or their neck hurting, of course, my paranoia automatically goes to meningitis. It is not that common, although it can definitely happen, especially with young adults, especially in places like college dorm rooms or on teams where they're sharing drinks and they're in a close proximity. It can actually spread very quickly. Haemophilus influenza. This is most common among young children, and if children are not treated for it, it is actually fatal. This is actually something that children can be vaccinated for. Listeriosis. This is another disease that is caused by Listeria monocytogenes. And this can cause meningitis in unborn babies. So this is something that pregnant women are warned of. And so they're usually warned to stay away from unpasteurized things like unpasteurized milk and cheeses, also dairy, all dairy products that aren't pasteurized, as well as deli meat. I remember my OBGYN warning me when I was pregnant, make sure that, you're staying away from sushi. California maki is okay, but no sushi, no unpasteurized cheeses like the soft cheeses, things like brie, because of listeriosis. This is also one of those things that sometimes we hear about with recalls, that sometimes we hear about listeriosis with that. And then finally, if we had a patient that we suspected that had one of these diseases, we could actually do some diagnostics. And the one diagnostic that we are actually going to be doing in lab at the very end of the semester is the analytical profile index. Now our equipment is so sophisticated that you can basically add in the microbe, and a computer will basically spit out the identity. So in a clinical lab, if we suspected a patient had a disease, we could actually look at its entire biochemical profile so that we could identify it. In very beginning of micro, we spent a lot of time looking at bacteria underneath the microscope, talking about what they look like, the shape, the arrangement, gram reactions, if they're spore formers. But to really identify and to really get a picture of what the bacteria is, we really need to look at all of its biochemistry. So what you're looking at here are these wells that will test for certain biochemistry. So what types of metabolism do they undergo? What types of carbohydrate sources do they like? What type of fermentation do they undergo? So these types of tests would allow us to look at these and identify a bacteria very quickly. We're actually going to be looking at the API test, the Analytical Profile Index, at the end of the semester. We have sprinkled in a lot of bacterial diseases. We will continue to talk about different causative agents and diseases throughout the semester. Again, I just want to remind you, this is not a human health and disease class. So this is really has to do with recognition.